Hello and welcome to TTF's Learning Matters, a podcast where we discuss all matters related to learning. Well, we're saying learning, but it's actually gaps in learning in the wake of the long pandemic that has teachers in schools all over the world tied up in knots. What's a learning gap? I think something that we call a disparity between what a student has actually learned and what he or she is expected to learn at a particular grade. So in other words, it's the gap between the expected and the actuals in terms of learning. To discuss this with us, we have two very dynamic educators who have demonstrated remarkable leadership, of course, even much before the pandemic, but during and post the pandemic, there was some exemplary leadership because of which their respective teams not just tided over the vagaries of the pandemic, but are now making a seamless transition back to school. We're delighted to have with us Rekha Chari, Head of Elementary Curriculum and Advocacy and Outreach at Mallya Aditi International School, and Vijai Rajagopal, Director, Vidyaniketan Public School. Both of these schools are based in Bangalore. Welcome to this podcast, Rekha and Vijay.
Thank you for having both of us. I'm speaking on behalf of Rekha as well.
Thank you, Vijay. Thank you for having us, Sandhya.
Talking about learning gaps, should we be talking about learning gaps and teaching gaps in the same breath? Just to give you an example, like there are certain, I would say, some vices of conventional classrooms, like for example, excessive teacher talk, lack of questioning or lack of thinking during learning, or this very scant attention that we pay to formative assessment. All of this, when transferred to the online mode, well, again, I think it really took its toll on learning in certain situations, right? So, do you think teaching, basically what I mean to say is that maybe teaching and learning gaps go hand in hand. So what do you think is the lesson for teachers going forward? And what do you think a post-pandemic classroom should look like? What are the lessons for us?
Like I said, my entire team came back saying that 30-minute was so sharp and so organized, and we had it going so well. And that's just about how much students could take in. And that you ended 30 minutes, it was you had 10 minutes transition time, which you probably don't get in a regular school. You're like, okay, move it, it's time for the next class, where you had that 10-minute transition time and you ended early. So that worked. So in terms of teaching gaps, yes, like Vijay said, looking at more engaging conversations with students, looking at more engagement with didactic materials, with things that you can, physically work with to understand concepts. That's an interesting question, though. The teaching gaps. Vijay, if you would like to add something to this.
I think what Sandhya is basically alluding to is two aspects. One is teacher competence. The second thing is teacher efficacy, right? When you bring these two things together, there are going to be people who are better than certain other people. That's a given, right? It's the case in any system. Now the question is, does it have an impact on student learning? Indeed, it does. Research says that teacher efficacy is, if not the single biggest, it is a critical determinant of student achievement and learning, right? Schools have to address it. School leaders will have to address it. But then if they have to address it, one cannot just, barge into the staff rooms and say, look, today we're going to address this. They must have, or they should, cultivate a certain culture that allows for such kind of dialogue to prevail. And it's going to be a painstaking process, possibly far more painstaking than addressing the learning gap in isolation as it pertains to students, because here you're talking of adults and changing their mindsets and changing asking them to move out of their comfort zones, right? But to the question that you raised, Sandhya, I think it does have an impact on learning. It's not that schools or teachers are not aware of it. the bad habits that have been learned within the four walls of a conventional classroom definitely have to be unlearned, right? And I think the time is now. They have no choice, because if they continued what they thought worked, it is not going to really solve the problem that they're confronting. So, I mean, you can debate about it at length, but I feel schools, school leaders, and teachers need to build a growing awareness about their own practice. They need to be far more reflective about their own practice.
Yeah, I think we need that as reflective practitioners, where we are thinking each time about making those changes. So, number one, and when we're talking of adapting to different situations, I think that's what it requires, a lot of reflection from our end, and as educators, as leaders, to make that change. So I just feel, or our experience has been that as much as the learning gaps have magnified, even there the teaching gaps, which was sort of maybe sometimes covert, not there, have also come out. I think you raised this point where you said it's being done in front of so many people, or you have others, parents looking at it. That is number one. But in terms of all your surveys and data, research data, also telling us that in fact, there's a World Bank report, World Bank and UNESCO report, which brought out this report on learning poverty. And it says pre-pandemic level in India, we were 54%, and post-pandemic, we are 70% in India, learning poverty, right, levels. So as I said, so there's a lot of research and data doing the rounds, but I think it's also because somewhere, why are we not able to adapt, or why were we, in some cases, may not be in schools like yours, but if it is, then it's, I think, something worth for us even systemically to think about also, right?
Indeed.
Yeah, Rekha, would I
it's true that in terms of the great divide, which became pretty obvious in terms of those that could afford the technologies and those that couldn't. So when you talk about systemic changes, it's a gargantuan task. And how do we get there? But one hopes that some change, I mean, it'll take time, things will take time, but that there will be some change in the thinking of how these, because like you said, perhaps Vijay school and our school is the privileged lot, which could just, we're already always reflecting on our practice, and therefore were prepared to move on and go online and then just switch to offline, is because we're constantly dialoguing with our teachers about this and constantly upskilling and staying abreast of new pedagogies. So yes, not many schools had that privilege. Not many schools would have that advantage. So when you're saying that these things were happening covertly, so it's not just that post-pandemic things have to change. I think these were also the long-time sufferers, unfortunately, during the pandemic itself, not knowing how to now transition and not knowing how to do the move from the sage on the stage to the, guide by the side. So that would have been difficult for them. And now again, switching back, having just about learning how to, reading up and kind of staying watching and learning from other people, and now back to square one. And how many schools would really be knowledgeable or be cognizant of the fact that things are not normal, things you are not going to be as they were, and you cannot just take off from where you left off 2 years back. So yes, that's true.
Absolutely. And I really do hope that they continue being guided by the side rather than going back to sage on the stage. Even if in our physical classrooms, I hope that that's what reflective practice, if there has been enough of reflection and dialoguing, hopefully that's a point that you would have understood. Our teachers should understand that really gave rise to more positive learning experiences.
In lighter vein, sage on the stage, guide by the side, I think time has come to become the meddler in the middle.
Yes, that's true. You're straddling that, right? You're neither here nor there. You're just you're on the fence.
Yeah.
My favorite quote, by the way. Move on. And what is it that you know that Google or YouTube doesn't know and that a student cannot access? You just stand by the side and just show them the way and the right information to be gained. Don't give gyan from up there, because they'll challenge you. They'll know much more than you do.
So, it's been great talking to both of you, Vijay and Rekha. Your points and your perspectives have been so interesting. It's going to give our listeners a lot of new ideas. Thank you both so much for being a part of this podcast.
In our next podcast, we continue our discussion with Rekha Chari and Vijai Rajagopal, where we analyze the reasons for these learning gaps. Stay tuned.